Have you ever wondered if your own name tells the truth about who you are? What if the label carrying your history was actually a mistake made by strangers centuries ago? If you believe the past deserves to be heard clearly, please tap the like button right now. It costs nothing, but it signals that you value truth over convenience. Subscribe to join this journey of discovery and share this with someone who loves history enough to question it. Imagine a map of the northern world. Look at the vast stretch of land that covers much of what we now call Canada. It is a place of immense beauty and harsh reality. From the cold waters of Hudson Bay to the rugged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, there is a distance so great it defies easy understanding. It spans over 3,000 kilometers. To put that in perspective, imagine walking from the western edge of Europe all the way to the eastern borders of Ukraine. That is the scale we are talking about. It is a landscape of dense boreal forests, frozen tundra, and wide open grasslands. For a very long time, historians and mapmakers looked at this enormous territory and saw one single thing. They saw one people. They saw one nation. They used one word to describe everyone living across this massive expanse. That word was Cree. On paper, the story seemed simple enough. It was a story of movement. It was a story of expansion. The narrative suggested that a single group of people started in one specific location near James Bay. From there, they supposedly spread outwards. They moved west onto the plains. They moved north into the subarctic. They moved deep into the forests. They took their language with them. They took their culture with them. They took their identity with them. This story was taught in schools. It was written in government documents. It was repeated in casual conversations for generation after generation. It was a tidy story. It was a convenient story. It fit neatly into a single paragraph of a history textbook. But convenience and truth are rarely the same thing. And science does not care about what is convenient for a textbook. Science cares about what is written in the code of life itself. When researchers finally decided to look deeper, they turned to modern genetics. They wanted to sequence the DNA of communities across this enormous territory. They expected to find a clear signal. They expected to find one ancestral root. They expected to see the genetic footprint of a single group spreading out like ripples in a pond. But that is not what they found. Instead, they found something almost impossible to explain with the old story. The genetics did not match the name. Communities that were thousands of kilometers apart shared the same label. They often spoke related languages. They shared certain cultural practices. But their deep ancestry told completely different stories. It was as if history had quietly split one identity into several without anyone noticing. It was as if a single word had been stretched so thin that it covered up distinct realities. This raises a question that nobody in the colonial era ever thought to ask. Was this group ever truly one people to begin with? Or was it something else entirely? Was it something invented? To understand this, we have to look at how the name came to exist. No community ever called themselves by that specific word. The term is a French shortening of a longer name. It came from an indigenous word once used to describe bands living near James Bay. French traders took that borrowed label. They stretched it over every Algonquian-speaking group they met north of Lake Superior. In other words, an entire people came to be named by a mistake in translation. It was made by outsiders who barely understood the land they were mapping. Picture how this actually happened on the ground. Imagine a French trader meeting a guide near the bay. He asks who lives further north. The guide answers with a word describing one specific band. It was a word never meant to describe anyone beyond that small group. The trader writes it down. He shortens it because his tongue finds it easier to pronounce. He carries that word west to the next trading post, then to the next, then to the next. Each time it gets stamped onto a new group of people. These were people who had never heard it applied to themselves before. Within a few decades, a casual mispronunciation had become an official label. It stretched across half a continent. Nobody ever went back to ask the people themselves what they actually called their own nation. This explanation sounds tidy, it sounds complete, but it has a problem that nobody likes to mention. If every person carrying this name did descend from one small population near the bay, and if they truly spread outward in just a few generations, their DNA should show a very specific pattern. Scientists call it a founder signal. It looks like a tight genetic bottleneck. It is followed by a clean expansion outward. That is not what the evidence shows. To understand why, we have to go back much further than the fur trade. We have to go back to the ice. Thousands of years ago, massive glaciers buried most of what is now Canada. The boreal forest simply did not exist. Life either retreated ahead of the ice or vanished entirely. Then, around 12,000 years ago, the ice began to melt. The land opened up again slowly, region by region. But here's the key detail almost nobody talks about. This land was not repopulated by one wave of people moving together. It was resettled over thousands of years by multiple groups. They arrived from different directions. They came from different shelter regions. They followed the retreating ice at different times. The genetic makeup of the interior still carries the fingerprints of that long, layered process. Communities that speak closely related dialects today can carry ancestries that split apart long before the word ever existed. The woodland groups of the Boreal Shield carry a different genetic signature than the plains groups living on the southern grasslands. The people of Quebec eastern regions show yet another distinct pattern. These are not small variations inside one founding family tree. These are separate deep histories. Each one is thousands of years old. Now they're hidden underneath a single colonial label. Think about what that actually means for a family living today. A family in northern Manitoba and a family in southern Alberta might both introduce themselves using the exact same word. They might sing similar songs. They might share similar grammar in their language. They might even attend the same national gatherings. Yet buried inside their cells are two ancestral stories that split apart long before the pyramids were built. Long before writing existed anywhere on Earth, one word had quietly absorbed two entirely different journeys through time. And almost nobody alive today was ever told that the split existed at all. Then researchers looked at a neighboring people. They looked at the Blackfoot. Historically, they were rivals. They spoke a completely different language. In 2024, a major study made a stunning discovery. It was published in a leading scientific journal. It was done in partnership with members of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Geneticists found that the Blackfoot carry a genetic lineage that had never been documented before. It was a lineage that split off from every other known Indigenous American ancestry roughly 18,000 years ago. That is, during the final stretch of the last ice age. That is a fifth ancient lineage. It had been sitting quietly inside living human DNA for 18,000 years waiting to be found. When scientists applied that same method to samples from the Cree communities, something unexpected showed up. The Plains groups, whose territory sits right next to Blackfoot land, carry traces of genetic connection. A fast 17th century migration from James Bay simply cannot explain this. There is something older there, something the standard story leaves out completely. This finding matters because these groups are not supposed to share deep ancestry in the standard narrative. They are described as separate peoples, speaking unrelated languages. They are said to become neighbors only after the expansion reached the plains. Families intermarried with neighboring peoples. They mixed with the Blackfoot, they mixed with the Assiniboine, they mixed with the Ojibwe and Athabascan groups. Under this view, the nation is a relatively young population. They absorb genetic diversity as they spread across the continent. First came the name. The genetics followed later. The second explanation flips that story completely. It suggests the communities we now call by this name were already living across the subarctic and boreal interior for thousands of years. This was before any European arrived. Each group kept its own distinct ancestry inside its own ecological zone. The forest people stayed forest people. The plains people stayed plains people. Under this theory, the language spread the way trade languages often do. It was a shared tool for communication between different peoples. It was not proof that one single group migrated and multiplied. The French recorded them as one people, but it was really many separate peoples. They happened to share a language family. Later, they shared a colonial label. The third explanation goes even further. It argues that the entire category was invented purely for administrative convenience. It was a word created by fur traders and map makers. They wanted to organize their dealings with dozens of distinct bands. These bands never saw themselves as one unified people at all. The Plains communities called themselves by their own name. The communities in Quebec called themselves by another. The label was never their word. It was the empire word. And if the category itself was invented from the outside, then asking who they really are genetically may be the wrong question. The boundary was never drawn by the people living inside it. Notice how each of these three explanations tells a completely different emotional story. The first one is a story of expansion and success. It is about people spreading across a continent through skill and adaptation. The second is a story of quiet endurance. It is about distinct nations surviving in place for thousands of years. They were connected only by a shared way of speaking. The third is a story of erasure and outside power. It is about drawing lines on a map. It is about forcing separate peoples into a single box for convenience. All three explanations can be partly true at once. That is exactly what makes this puzzle so difficult. It is also what makes it so important to untangle carefully. If you have made it this far, you already care more about real history than most people ever will. So, do something simple. Drop a comment with just one word. Write ice, forest, or plains. Tell me which part of this story surprised you the most. It helps this video reach more curious minds like yours. After the study was published, researchers went back. They re-examined existing genetic data from Canadian subarctic peoples. They used a much more detailed lens. Working across multiple published data sets, population geneticists applied the exact same method. They looked at plains, woodland, and swampy communities. What they found supported the second and third explanations at the same time. Plains communities living closest to Blackfoot territory carried genetic signatures consistent with deep ancestry. This ancestry was far too old to have arrived through a few generations of fur trade era migration. These populations, or their close relatives, had likely been living in that land for far longer than the colonial record ever suggested. Meanwhile, the woodland groups of the Boreal Shield showed a completely different pattern. It was consistent with a long, continuous presence in the northern forest. This went back thousands of years. It was connected to ancient populations that had adapted to that specific environment over an extremely long time. And the people of eastern Quebec revealed yet a third distinct cluster. One with genetic ties pointing toward ancestral populations from the northeastern woodlands. 3 separate genetic clusters, one shared name, multiple deep independent histories. The genetic record was not showing a single people spreading outward from one starting point. It was showing something far bigger. It was showing an entire continent worth of ancient human presence. Later, it was stitched together under one borrowed French word. Consider the scale of what this actually means. We're not talking about small cultural differences. We're not talking about 2 neighboring towns having slightly different accents. We're talking about ancestral lines that stretch back thousands of years before contact with Europe. Lines that developed separately, lines that adapted to separate environments. Only later did they find themselves sharing a language family. Eventually, they shared a single colonial label. It is a bit like discovering that 3 unrelated rivers had all been given the same name on an old map. This happened simply because the surveyor never bothered to check whether they actually connected. This is where the story takes its sharpest turn, because what this means is not just historical, it is deeply personal. It changes the very definition of identity itself. The real question stops being where do they come from? The real question becomes, what does it actually mean to say someone belongs to this nation at all? If this category was created by outsiders, based on a name that was misheard, then the genetic diversity inside that category is not confusion. It is truth. It reflects the real complicated depth of the continent. It does not reflect the journey of a single people. The DNA is not telling us the true ancestry of one people. It is telling us that the word was always too small to hold everything it was forced to contain. And what it held was extraordinary, multiple ancient lineages, each with its own deep personal relationship to a specific landscape. The boreal forest, the subarctic plains, the rocky coastline of Hudson Bay. These were not empty places waiting to be discovered. They were homes shaped and managed by distinct peoples for thousands of years. This was before a French mapmaker ever needed a single word to label them all at once. This pattern is not unique to this region. Genetics keeps uncovering the same mechanism again and again. It happens on almost every continent where colonial powers imposed simple categories. They imposed them over deep, complicated indigenous diversity. Naming is never neutral. When a government or a trading company draws an invisible line around a group of people, that name gains power. It shapes land claims. It shapes legal rights. It shapes medical research. It shapes who is allowed to enroll in a nation and who is not. Similar patterns have shown up in other parts of the world. In parts of Africa, colonial administrators grouped dozens of distinct ethnic communities under single broad labels. They did it for the sake of easier taxation. They did it for easier control. In parts of South America, record keepers lumped together nations that had never considered themselves related. They did it simply because they lived within the same colonial province. Time and again, a name meant for bookkeeping quietly hardened into something people started to believe was a natural ancient truth. This case is simply one of the clearest examples we now have. Modern genetics gives us a way to actually test the story. We can test it against the evidence buried inside real human bodies. And now the genetic record is quietly showing that the people placed inside the name were never one single uniform group to begin with. This matters more than most people realize. In medicine, certain genetic conditions appear far more often in specific communities, but they are not evenly spread across every group carrying that name. They cluster tightly in specific regions. Treating all of them as one single genetic population misleads researchers. It can cost real people accurate diagnoses and treatment. In law, this new genetic evidence actually supports something many communities have said in their oral traditions. Their deep connection to their specific homeland is not a product of a fast 17th century expansion. It is the result of thousands of years of continuous presence on that exact land. And in identity, this discovery means something profound. When an elder from northern Saskatchewan says her people have belonged to that land for thousands of years, the genetic record now backs her up. It backs her up in a way that no old fur trade narrative was ever designed to capture. For generations, colonial history books treated Indigenous oral tradition as folklore. They were interesting stories passed down without hard proof behind them. Government reports and school curriculums often leaned on the fur trade timeline instead. They treated written European records as fact. They treated spoken Indigenous memory as myth. This new genetic evidence quietly flips that hierarchy. It suggests that the oral traditions were tracking real deep history all along. The written colonial record was often the shallow version of events. Before we reach the end, one more thing. If this video changed how you think about history, share it with someone who still believes the past is simple. Every share helps a story like this survive the algorithm. It reaches someone who genuinely needs to hear it. Now, imagine something simple. Imagine sending your own DNA away for testing. The results come back confirming Indigenous ancestry from the Canadian interior. It is tied to populations who lived through the Ice Age. They followed caribou. They survived brutal winters no modern person could easily imagine. But the results cannot tell you which specific band your ancestors belonged to. They cannot tell you which language your great-great-grandmother actually spoke at home. They cannot tell you exactly where her family camped when winter came. They cannot tell you where they traveled when the geese returned each spring. The genetic record runs incredibly deep, but it is not precise enough to answer those personal questions. It can show you the outline of the forest. It cannot show you the exact tree your family went sheltered beneath. That specific knowledge does not live inside a DNA sample. It lives in oral tradition passed down voice to voice for generations. It lives inside language itself. It lives inside the land. It lives in the names given to rivers, lakes, and gathering places. Names that existed long before any European map maker ever wrote them down. DNA can confirm how deep and how old that presence truly is. But the full meaning of that presence has always belonged to the people who lived it. It does not belong to a laboratory. This is worth sitting with for a moment. It applies to almost everyone watching this. We live in an age obsessed with genetic testing kits. We are obsessed with ancestry percentages. We look at colorful pie charts, claiming to explain exactly who we are. But this story is a warning against putting too much faith in numbers alone. A DNA test can point you toward a region. It can point to a broad population. It can point to a rough timeline. It can never hand you your grandmother lullaby. It can never tell you the specific bend in a river where your family once fished every summer for 1,000 years. Those things survive only if someone chooses to keep telling them. What this case reveals goes far beyond one nation history. For more than 3 centuries, a single word was treated as though it named one people. It was first used by one Indigenous community. It was borrowed by French colonizers. It was shortened by English administrators. Then it was stamped onto dozens of separate communities spread across half a continent. Think about how long 3 centuries actually is. It is longer than the entire history of the country that now calls itself Canada. It is roughly 12 human generations. Each one was raised believing a version of history that modern science is only now able to properly question. 12 generations of children learning the same simplified timeline in school. 12 generations of officials filling out forms based on a category built by traders. They never asked permission to create it, and it took a single DNA study published in a scientific journal most people will never read to quietly begin unraveling all of it. The DNA says otherwise, and it says it clearly. Beneath that borrowed name lies a continent worth of human depth. Communities that learned to survive brutal tundra winters. Communities that learned to survive wide-open grasslands. Communities that managed vast boreal forests. Communities that lived on the harsh, beautiful coastline of Hudson Bay. Communities that traded. Communities that clashed. All while keeping something precious alive inside their own languages. They kept it alive in their own ceremonies. They kept it alive in their own unbroken relationship with a very specific piece of land. It is a kind of identity so detailed. It is so rooted that no single colonial word could ever truly contain it. The genetic record does not shrink them down to something smaller. It does not make them simpler. It does the opposite. It expands them into something far larger than the textbooks ever imagined. It shows that what European mapmakers folded into one convenient word was in truth many different stories. It was many separate ancestral lines. It was many thousands of years of continuous human life, each one shaped by its own unique corner of the land. And there is something quietly hopeful buried inside all of this. For centuries, colonial systems tried to flatten indigenous nations into simple categories. They wanted them easier to tax, easier to relocate, easier to write about in a single paragraph. Science, the very tool colonial powers once used to justify their control, is now exposing the truth. It is exposing how false those flattened categories really were. The deeper researchers dig, the more complexity they uncover. The more the complexity matches exactly what Indigenous communities have been saying about themselves. They have been saying it in their own languages. They have been saying it through their own oral histories. This was long before anyone thought to check a strand of DNA. So the question was never really, who are they? The real question is the one worth sitting with long after this video ends. What exactly did we lose as a species? What did we lose the moment someone decided that one single word was enough? Maybe the answer is simpler and sadder than we want it to be. We lost specificity. We lost the names of rivers that mattered to one family but not another. We lost the difference between a people who tracked caribou across frozen tundra. We lost the difference between a people who followed bison across open grass. We folded all of it into one convenient word. We did it because one word was easier to write on a map. It was easier to put on a treaty. It was easier to teach in a single history lesson. But the land remembers what the paperwork forgot. The DNA remembers what the maps erased. The people themselves never actually forgot who they were. Their languages remember. Their songs remember. Their stories passed quietly from elder to child remember. They never forgot, even while the rest of the world insisted on calling them by someone else's name. If this video made you see the word differently, then you already understand exactly why stories like this matter. Keep asking these questions. History is never as simple as the label we were given. The truth is always deeper, the truth is always more complex, and the truth is always worth finding. We must consider what happens next. Now that the science has spoken, the story does not end. It begins anew. Communities now have data that supports their own ancient claims. They have proof that their presence is not recent. It is foundational. This changes how treaties are understood. It changes how land rights are argued in court. It changes how medical care is delivered to remote regions. But beyond the legal and the medical, there is the human element. There is the feeling of belonging. When a young person learns that their ancestry is not a mistake, but a deep root, something shifts inside them. Pride replaces confusion. Certainty replaces doubt. This is the power of correcting the record. It is not just about fixing a textbook. It is about fixing a sense of self. It is about restoring dignity that was stripped away by a careless word, a word spoken by a trader who did not care about the nuance, a word written by a clerk who did not care about the history. That word carried weight for 300 years. It carried the weight of identity. It carried the weight of belonging. And now that weight is being redistributed. It is being returned to the specific communities who earned it through millennia of survival. They survived the ice. They survived the colonization. They survived the erasure. And now they are surviving the correction. So as we close this chapter, remember that history is not a static thing. It is not a stone tablet carved once and left alone. It is a living river. It changes course as we learn more. It deepens as we dig harder. The story of the Cree is a mirror for all of us. It asks us to look at the labels we carry. It asks us to look at the names we use for others. Are they true? Are they specific? Or are they just convenient? The answer matters, because when we simplify people, we lose them. We lose their depth. We lose their story. And we lose a part of ourselves in the process. Let us choose to see the complexity. Let us choose to honor the specific. Let us choose to listen to the land. It has been speaking all along. We just finally learned how to hear it.